So, Jason, when I worked in the corporate world, I've been running my business for 10 years now, so it does feel like a long time ago. I still work within organizations, but when I was employed, I worked mainly within financial services institutions that had been running a long time.
Mm.
And I was in leadership development, talent development, and culturally, the challenge that was prevalent throughout my time working with executives in that area, with the senior leaders and the managers,
hmm
was the inability to deal with the hard stuff
Mm.
in a way that everybody felt okay to do that. There was a culture through years and years and years of all the red tape and the legislation that meant that you couldn't speak up. And so therefore it wasn't encouraged. And I
hmm
myself was that type of person, through social conditioning. I had grown up to know that you got to kind of keep the peace. You've got to be empathetic. But as we know, that can flip, that can go against what we're trying to achieve, that can actually be detrimental. And so I'm honored to speak with you today, and I would love to get your view on why radical candor is landing so powerfully within people's lives, organizations, and teams.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to chat with you and with your audience. I'm so thrilled to have this conversation. And I think the simplest way that I can put why radical candor is landing so well is because for me, just like for me, I think there are many people out there that are trying quite hard to live the values of radical candor. So for people who aren't unfamiliar with the framework, the idea of radical candor is pretty simple, which is like you want to care personally and challenge directly at the same time. That's it. It's a pretty simple idea. Hard to implement for a number of reasons, like you described, social conditioning, etc. But if you abstract those axes out, you wind up at love and truth. And there isn't like a person or a culture in the world who doesn't really value both love and truth, right? Like how we express them is very different, person to person, family to family, culture to culture, organization to organization. But those principles hold. And I think what's so attractive about radical candor is it gives you a frame through which you can examine your relationships down to the conversation, the individual interaction level, and think about what you would need to do to move them in the right direction. So think of like radical candor as sort of a compass that helps you get conversations with particular people to a better place and at the same time helps you live those sort of underlying values of love and truth, of caring and challenging at the same time. And so there's something sort of just, I think, fundamentally human. There's a human desire to like live close to truth, right? To not hide the way that we think or the way that we feel about things. And there's also a fundamental human desire to be in connection with other people. And that's the care personally dimension. So like that I think is what convinced me to talk to Kim in the first place when we were thinking about starting this business, was this feeling that she had done something really powerful, which is to organize a bunch of ideas that were sort of disorganized in my own mind, and to give me a useful and clear tool to use to hew closer to my values. So that's my guess. Obviously I'm literally reading myself into that story. So like other people may find it useful for a different reason, but that's certainly what attracted me to it. And I've heard that story from other people, which leads me to believe it's a pretty common.
Well, and I think about when I came across this book, it was quite a while ago now. It's quite a few years ago now that I was introduced to this. And actually, yeah, when you boil it down to those two things of love and truth, that's really, I guess, what really struck a chord with me. Because up until that point, and I'd done a lot of work on it over the years, and I was sort of unlearning a lot of behaviors and things like that, the love part was okay because I cared. I'm in the people profession, I really care deeply about people. But the truth bit in conjunction with the love was harder. It was harder to bring to the forefront. And so you're right in that the framework in which this is built is simple, and yet you can incrementally, day by day, use it as a checkpoint to guide you in your conversations. And for those that don't know, yes, it's about that, but let's break it down a little bit more, because within this framework, we've got key components. Yes, you have care personally and challenge directly, but we have other elements to that. Are you okay to just give us a
Sure,
flavor of
yeah.
what it's about?
Absolutely. So the way to think about this is, imagine a set of axes. I'll bring you back to high school algebra or geometry. And the vertical axis is going to be care personally, and the horizontal axis is going to be challenge directly. And in that upper right-hand quadrant is where you find radical candor. So that's care personally and challenge directly. And then the other quadrants represent what we think of as sort of common mistakes that people make in their communication with others. And the reason why it's important to recognize that radical candor is not a personality test. So unlike a lot of other sort of communication frameworks, it's not like who am I and who are you and how do we communicate more effectively together. In part because Kim is just sort of allergic to the idea of like putting people in boxes. But I think more importantly, because all those frameworks have a negative side effect, which is they cause us to put ourselves in a box. So it can actually limit our thinking when we sort of like frame ourselves as like a particular type of person or communicator. We start to limit our own thinking about what is possible. Whereas radical candor, I think, opens possibilities for what is possible by acknowledging that we all make these mistakes all the time. So I'm going to go around the quadrants in a clockwise order. So in the lower right hand, we have where you have a situation where you're high on challenge directly, but you're low on care personally. And that means you're being obnoxiously aggressive, or at least that's what Kim calls it. And I think it's important to recognize, like, we have all done this, right? We have all challenged other people directly without showing that we care, even if we do care. So this isn't about like, oh, we just don't care about this person or we're an uncaring person. There are times where we forget to show that we care, but we do challenge. And the problem with that is, while it's efficient from like an information sort of data transfer perspective, like we're getting the challenge across, it's very inefficient from a helpfulness or behavior change perspective, because we make the person feel bad about the thing that we are telling them, right? We make them feel like we're not actually invested in their success, which makes them less likely to listen to us. So even though the data may have transferred over the wire, the information isn't like you interpreted, used, or internalized. So it seems efficient, but it's because of the communication side of things or the data transfer side of things, but it's actually inefficient from the end goal of giving somebody else feedback or communicating with somebody else, which is to like build a shared understanding and find a way to move forward together.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking of, places and examples and situations, because you're right, it's not necessarily a personality. It's, we can all be someone who in a particular moment isn't thinking about the other person as much as the message we're trying to deliver, particularly if we're down to the wire. We're in a high stake, high pressure environment within the workplace. We are also experiencing that pressure ourselves. We don't know any other influencing technique other than the stick, in that situation. And so we can only use that because we don't have any other tools in our box, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people reach for that, not because they want to harm somebody else, but because they're sort of frustrated or lack the skill, to your point, to find another way. And so when people behave in an obnoxiously aggressive way, most people wind up regretting that, right? They wind up feeling like that was a mistake or that was wrong. And the good news is, like, it's not your personality. Everybody acts like a jerk from time to time. Like, we wish we didn't, but we do act like a jerk from time to time. And the great thing about the framework is it tells you, well, to solve that, what you need to do is move up on care personally. That's how you recover from making the mistake of behaving like a jerk. So let's keep going. I'm going to go now to the lower left-hand quadrant. We're going to keep going in a clockwise fashion. In the lower left, we have where you're low on both care personally and challenge directly. And so what does that look like? An extreme version of this is like backstabbing, where you're actually actively trying to undermine somebody. That's sort of an obvious one. And when people tend to think of this quadrant, they tend to go to that extreme of like, the like, oh, I don't behave in this way. Like I would never do this to somebody else. And I would agree that backstabbing is pretty rare, but also in this quadrant is talking about somebody instead of talking to that person directly. And that is something that I guarantee every single person who's listening to this podcast episode has done, including me.
Yeah.
And it's a mistake that I continue to make occasionally. I think, and you know, you can call it gossip, and I think that tends to minimize the importance of like processing. Like sometimes what we're trying to do is sort of like process our understanding, but there's a point at which we're done processing and we're really just complaining.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And at that point, the thing that I would like the person I'm talking to do to say, hey, like, I think you got it clear in your own head now. Your job is to go talk to Helen directly and have this conversation with her directly. So again, we understand like the way out, which is we need to move up on care personally and out on challenge directly in order to get out of this quadrant. And I think the really important thing to understand, like one of the questions we get all the time is like, how do I build trust? Like, isn't trust a prerequisite for radical candor? My answer is somewhat frustratingly circular, which is like, if you're not being radically candid, you are destroying trust. Like if you're down in manipulative insincerity or over an obnoxious aggression, you are actively diminishing trust in your team. And the whole point of this is like by moving toward clear and kind, right, communication, we actually move toward trust. We earn trust by saying what we actually think in a kind way.
That's exactly it. You know, I think of the situations where manipulative insincerity has happened and I have, you know, seen or witnessed or been part of, is that, you know, it's outwardly being agreeable
Right.
and then in somewhere else behaving differently. Even if you're doing that to yourself, even if outwardly you are being agreeable, but you are resentful, you are cynical, your resentment has set in, and so it's a values misalignment. It's a misalignment in values. It's, you know, it doesn't feel right as well. You know that feeling is not a good feeling. And so even though it might feel like it's a kind of stuck place, it doesn't have to be. And that's again why this framework is great, because you move up and you
Yeah.
move out.
Yeah.
But the quadrant that I can relate to the most is the one you're going to move on to now.
Yeah, that's where you're high on care personally, but low on challenge directly. And we refer to that as ruinous empathy. And I think there's a great book called Against Empathy, which explains why empathy can be, which is generally regarded as a very good thing. And it is really important from like a human relationship perspective. There's two kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, which is like you intellectually understanding why someone might feel the way that they do. And then there is emotional empathy, which is you actually feel the way that the other person feels. And I think cognitive empathy can be really useful, but it can also be a liar. And Against Empathy, they basically make this case that we tend to feel more empathetic to people who are more like us. And so there's some danger in focusing on empathy. And Kim takes that a step further by saying there's a potential for paralysis in the face of empathy, especially if you feel that second kind, right? If you experience the second kind of empathy where you're feeling how the other person is feeling, and all of a sudden this person who you know is having a hard time, there's something going on with their kid at home or their significant other at home, you know that's affecting their work, and all of a sudden we're sitting there sort of paralyzed because we're like, well, I can't really tell them that they're screwing up at work because they're already so overwhelmed with everything else that it's going to come across as sort of like callous and unsupportive.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of problems with that. So first, they know they're screwing up. And by not talking about it, it puts them into that quadrant of like, I'm lying to myself, or like, I feel like I'm hiding something. I don't have a way to talk about this thing, because you don't have to impugn somebody to talk about making mistakes at work. Instead, you can be supportive in talking about the mistakes that are being made and figure out like, what is the plan to get out of this? Especially like we've all had a person who's like performed really well on a team that we've worked on. All of a sudden their performance takes a nosedive, and we either understand what's going on or we don't entirely understand what's going on, and we hesitate to address it because we're like, this person's been a high performer, I don't want to demotivate them. We tell ourselves the story that inaction is not harmful. But I would
Yeah.
argue that like the thing that destroys relationships is neglect, not disagreement. And when we are living in ruinous empathy, we're often living in neglect. We're not having the conversation that we need to have. And even though our intention might be good, the impact is really, really negative.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I can relate to there. This, in my career, it took me a long time to understand. I, really experienced the emotional empathy when I was coaching. I, became a coach at 18 at Virgin Atlantic Airways, and it took me a long time to understand the objectivity while still having cognitive empathy with someone, but maintaining an objectivity and a boundary around my emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we get lost in someone else's feelings and emotions, and then we're losing sight of where we are over here, and there's no logic there. And so therefore we can't be rational. And you say that neglect, it is a neglect.
Yeah, when it causes us not to act in the other person's best interest, it's a form of neglect. I think
Yeah.
that is the key realization that I had about ruinous empathy, is that it's lying to me. It's like I believe that I'm doing something that's in the other person's best interest, but it is not true. Like hiding what I think, or hiding what I perceive to be an important situation from somebody, from another adult. I'm not saying that this is true for every
Yeah.
situation in
Yeah.
life,
Yeah.
but from another adult that you're collaborating with at work, that's not fair. That is it's weirdly parental. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like a
That's
weirdly
it.
parental thing to do, and it sort of diminishes the other person's agency because you're withholding data from them that would actually be very important to them. And that's not how we would want to be treated if the situation was reversed, right? Like whenever you ask anybody about this and you're like, if someone was worried about your performance at work because of something that was going on in your personal life, would you prefer that they withhold that information from you or tell you directly? Everybody
Yeah.
says I prefer they tell me directly.
Yeah, of course. Of course. It's a responsibility to the other person in
Yep.
order to not rescue. It's that feeling or need to rescue,
Correct.
but to,
Collaborate.
yes. Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
That's how we need to start to see these conversations as collaboration, as opposed to me telling you. It's us discussing.
Yeah. And whilst you're talking there, I'm also thinking of the sort of transactional analysis, adult, adult, rather than parent, child dynamic, in terms of we always want to be moving towards adult, adult in our mindset. When we're entering into any conversation, it's I'm okay, you're okay, not I'm okay, you're not, which might be obnoxious aggression, or I'm not okay, you are, which is the ruinous empathy.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Exactly.
excuse me. So I have heard on a little bit of noise about radical candor. I remember doing a post, it was about a year ago now, about my, absolute investment and belief in the approach. And I had a few people comment on my post saying that it's been reported that some leaders have used it as almost an excuse to be ruthless. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, that goes against everything that it's about. But I had that more than once, that sort of that view. What are your thoughts on that experience of that? Have you heard about that?
Of course, yeah. I mean, in the second edition of the book, we wrote, Kim, Amy, and I wrote a foreword that talked about this explicitly. So, if for those folks who have the second edition, this will be a bit of a repeat. But essentially, I'll start high level and then I'll get really specific. Radical candor is a tool. Tools can be misused. Like it's always the case that a tool can be misused. And so I think one way to look at it is like, you should never design a tool that can be misused, which is literally impossible. Like there's no way to avoid it. So going into this, Kim expected and I expected that this would happen. So we work really hard to sort of like push against that idea. We'll shout from the rooftops that radical candor is measured not at the speaker's mouth but at the listener's ear. And so you cannot, there's no such thing as claiming you've been radically candid. Like that is a conversation. That's a thing that can only be determined in relationship with somebody else. And so anybody who is claiming to be radically candid is making a mistake. It's even worse if they're using it as a shield to sort of to protect themselves from criticism for the way that they're approaching it, because the whole idea behind radical candor, when we teach it, is we teach this idea of the order of operations. Like, where does radical candor start? Radical candor starts with soliciting feedback and offering praise. And so if you actually are like, if you're at all invested in radical candor beyond the words and into the actual methodology, you would know that that is a purposeful misuse, an intentional misuse of the framework. That said, it doesn't hurt any less knowing that the person is misusing the framework and being a jerk, or I should say, I'm correct myself, behaving like a jerk. We want to move away from being and into behaving. And so we do, when we get that type of feedback, like, and especially if the person points to a particular piece of communication or something that the person did, we almost always wind up agreeing with them that this is not radical candor. And this is, in fact, an example of obnoxious aggression.
Right.
And not to defend that. That's not about defending the framework, but to validate the person's experience and say, like, we've lost our door privileges. The screen was open. Somebody walked by, so now I put the shade across and closed the door.
It's cool.
Yeah, so I think our response is often to validate this person's experience and to help them sort of see or understand that this is a misuse of the framework, and to offer some ideas of how to approach someone who's done this. Because in many cases, the hard part to remember sometimes is like, leaders are people too. And so that person may actually think they're being radically candid, meaning they may not be using it as a shield. They may not be intentionally misusing the framework. They may just be ignorant or misunderstanding the framework and think they're doing it right. And so part of it is like, the radically candid thing to do would be to say, hey, Jason, I know you intended to be, you told us like your intention was to be radically candid, but like, I just wanted to tell you like how it landed for me as obnoxious aggression. And here's why, like, here's why it came across that way. And it doesn't mean that what you said wasn't useful. It just means like, that I want you to understand the emotional impact of it so that we can find a way to communicate in a kinder way moving forward, right? Like that to know that that's not as effective for me as, approaching me with a little bit more consideration for like me personally or my humanity.
And yeah, this is where having it become part of the language, the fabric of how you do things, using the framework as a safe space to be able to label and declare and to explain, makes things easier to navigate those types of conversations. If you don't have any type of framework for safety around this type of thing, you can't have the rumbles, as Brené Brown calls them, because you don't there's no sort of permission to do that. And so it leads me on to my next question, because I see, and I am part of, it's an honor to be part of your community that you have created around this concept framework approach. And I think there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that run their own business, that have expertise and are articulating that expertise in certain ways. They have their own frameworks, they have their own approaches, methodologies. And one thing that I have loved observing and being part of with yours is that it is so much more than the framework. It's so much more than the book in which the framework is described. And I just love to get your inside view on that, because as an observer, it's a fantastic thing. But I know that my listeners will be really interested to hear about this approach and the movement and how you kind of developed that.
Yeah, I think I had the good fortune of talking to a friend who I hadn't caught up with in a long time yesterday. And she is in a very similar position to what you just described, which is like, she's got an idea and she's about to launch it. And she was sort of like, give me the inside scoop. And I think one of the pieces of wisdom, if you want to call it that, like hard won experience is how I describe it, was that it is, when you're building a business, it's very tempting to sort of externalize your goals, to like put them into metrics, to define them, because like there's things that are another great, is it an essay or a book, The Measurement Problem? I think it's a book, which basically says like, it is almost impossible to measure the things that really matter. the things that are easy to measure are often not really great, not even really great proxies for the things that actually matter. And so what I was realizing was that one of the things that I did effectively with Kim's support when we started this company was I sort of followed opportunity. Like I followed like energetically. I followed the people who are reaching out to us who are like excited about radical candor. Instead of saying, I need to convince a whole bunch of people to think differently about radical candor, what I was thinking about is like, how can I help the people who are thinking about radical candor do this better, to put it better into practice, to make more use, generate more value from the framework? Because if I can do that, I believe that they're going to invite other people in. That like, and convincing someone that you don't know of something is very, very hard. And so I think a lot of people, especially in the sort of idea space, can get caught up in this sort of cycle where they're trying to convert people as opposed to trying to sort of like energize the converted. And I just gave myself permission not to worry about, again, with like Kim's explicit support, because I was like, I don't want to convince somebody that radical candor is right for them, because I feel like if I do that, there's always going to be this friction or this feeling of sort of like coercion, which is fundamentally against what radical candor stands for. Like radical candor at its core is about sharing perspective in an open way so that you do not behave coercively. Like the whole idea is to not coerce other people, but instead to sort of have a meeting of the minds and the hearts and chart a course together. So I think that's at the core. And I know it's a bit of a long preamble to like, why do we build a community? But I think that we realized a couple of things. One, we often get brought in by companies to work with their teams. So like our primary business is actually a services business where we're doing live facilitated sessions where we're teaching people how to put radical candor into practice. That's usually the start of a relationship. And then we do some things after that to help them keep up the momentum. And what we realize is like in that situation, most of the people in the room are not convert. They're not fans. They're not converted. They're sort of like showing up to a training that the team has arranged for them.
I know that so well.
And so there was often a desire from our clients to compel people to do things after that session. Can we force them to take a course? Can we force them to do an assessment? Can we force them to do a follow-up? Because we really want to protect our investment. We're spending a bunch of money to bring you in to do this thing. We really want to protect our investment. And we went down that path a bunch of different times, and it always felt gritty and sort of bad, and like none of the things worked exactly the way that we wanted to. And then a year ago, I had this realization that we would never work with a client. We'd never start with a client that didn't want to work with us. like we would never do this if this was the way that they presented it to us, which is like, because the conversation we were having with the person who is bringing us in is, we've heard feedback from our team that we need to invest more in developing their skills around giving feedback or creating a framework and shared language, to your point earlier. That's the story that they were telling us coming in. And we recognize like, we're not going to convince everybody in 1-2 hour session that we're right. And my theory of change is that you don't actually need to convince everybody. In fact, you need to convince a relatively small number of people to do things differently in order to start creating the conditions where other people feel more confident in taking what they might perceive as a social risk of behaving in a more radically candid way. So the question is like, how are we supporting those people from our corporate, the pool of sort of corporate clients that we have? And then there was this whole other pool of people who weren't corporate clients, but instead had read the book or maybe watched a video about radical candor, who are coaching people or who are in L&D themselves. And they're trying to figure out like, how do I be like, I believe so much in what you're doing. How do I be a better sort of steward, or how do I get better information about like how to put this into practice? And the light bulb sort of went off. Like there's a group of people from both of these constituencies that have something in common, which is like a belief in radical candor and a desire to put it into better practice. And we didn't at that time have any sort of offering, a channel to put those people into that would help us communicate with them on an ongoing basis. And so out of that was born the community, like being in connection. So there's a bunch of value there, but like the primary things that we wanted to do was, one, give people a concrete action that they could take that would support their desire to put this into better practice after they've read the book, went to a workshop, whatever it might be. And the second thing was like to help people be in community with others who are doing the same thing, because it's really hard to be a champion of a change, especially like a change that sort of touches on cultural and social learned behaviors and things like that, right? Like we're unlearning. Part of being radically candid is unlearning a bunch of things that we've been trained on for most of our lives. And that's hard work. It's really hard to do that on your own. I would say basically impossible to do that on your own. And then the last thing was like, we realized that radical candor is a fundamentally not, it wasn't a realization, but it was sort of like to add to those two motivations was that radical candor is a fundamentally relational skill. And the only way to learn it is with other people.
True.
And so all of those things sort of like came together. The combination of realizations came together to say, we need to create a space to bring people together, and then create tools in that space that help people in community with one another achieve some of their goals with radical candor that would be hard to accomplish alone.
Mm-hmm. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about that in terms of the rich amount of free resources that are available to anybody on your website. So guides, podcast episodes, processes, additions to the concepts in the book that anybody can use as a support to develop their thinking further, to develop their practice further, even before going on a workshop. And so I think there's really a lot to say about that as well, because again, thinking about my audience, yes, there's lots of corporate leaders in my audience, but there's also those business owners wanting to share their ideas, but maybe feeling a little bit protective of their information and wanting to put stuff behind the paywall, you know. And actually, you know, there's a lot to be said of providing as much resource as possible to get people, you know, on board the train, as it were. And when you talk about a movement, you're so right in that you don't need everybody to be fully on board. It's a few people can cause a real positive ripple in that respect. And as I say, it's an honor to be part of this community. And when I go in and I'm reading the questions that people are posing, they're real life problems, challenges, scenarios that then other people are coming in and providing support and advice on. And everybody is incredibly supportive and helpful. But there's also something else. And I have been using AI and playing with AI for properly, seriously, for I'd say a bit over a year. And now I have custom tools that I have built that are integrated into processes, not only to streamline the business for myself, but also to help my clients as well. And one thing that I have seen out there in the wild is that AI is being used really well in certain situations to provide a support to communities. And then it also is being used not very well. And your community is a fantastic example of where it's being used really well, ethically, and you know, there's fantastic results as a result of using it. And I'd love if you're open to share how that has formed a part of this movement and what that actually looks like. I know that a lot of people would be really interested to hear.
Yeah, happy to. I think to try to keep this as concise as possible, like I have there's like a lot of things that I care about here, but there are three particular areas that I think are especially relevant to us and potentially to your audience. So one area is that I said before that radical candor is a fundamentally relational skill. AI provides, especially large language model AI. So AI has been around for a long time. It's been doing other things. It hasn't been talking to us. So like that's really the innovation of the last few years is like AI can talk to us in natural language. We can talk back to it in natural language. And through that, we can access vast computational power, which is like, that's a new thing for most people. And it's an incredibly democratizing thing, like the ability to, because like I think depending on where your audience is located, they all probably speak English, and many of them English as a first language, and many people may not even have a second language. But what's interesting, like a proficient second language. What I think of is so interesting is like you and I talk to AI in English, but there's someone who's talking to AI in Spanish and having just as rich of a conversation in Spanish. Same thing, German, Swahili. Like there's a million, you know what I'm saying? Like all these languages out there, like, and that's so powerful, like incredibly democratizing, because it has been the case for a really long time that almost all technological advancements are really only available to elites, in part because the interface, like the tools that we have to access that technology, requires like some understanding of tech or English or something else. Like there's some other set of requirements that tend to advantage one group of people over another. And I think that AI is one of the first ones that like I think actually has a chance. Like as you know, we have smartphones and everything else is spread around the world, and people have access to the internet on a regular basis in more and more places around the world. Again, not everywhere. AI operating in your native language means that you have the ability to like access for these vast computational resources that were never really available to you before. So I think that's incredibly cool that that's happening. And so that was like part of my motivation. You know, my previous gig was Khan Academy, which is an online educational not-for-profit. I did that for 7 years before I started Radical Candor. So I was like drawn to it for that reason. But as I got into it, what I realized was like, oh, this thing can kind of simulate a relationship. It's not a replacement for a relationship, but it can simulate a relationship. And that led me to realize like technology was finally at a place where it would actually allow you to richly practice some of the skills that are core to Radical Candor in a truly safe environment. Before you went out into the world and had that conversation with Helen, you could talk to AI and say, you know, this is what I'm thinking of saying, and this is how I'm thinking of saying it, and like, what feedback do you have for me about how I could do this better? And that got me excited about the idea of essentially creating assistive technology within the sort of frame of Radical Candor, delivered through the community, that allows people to do a number of things that would have been really hard to do. So one of the toughest parts about building a community is like, not everybody's online at the same time. Someone has a question, it sort of can go unanswered for a long period of time. And I was like, wow, like AI can help us solve that. Like we can generate an answer immediately to every question that gets asked. And if we frame it in the right way, I think it can engender conversation. It doesn't have to stop
Absolutely.
the
Yes.
conversation, but it can engender conversation. And so if you're in the Radical Candor community, you'll notice that the AI, when it unprompted responds to something, it always says, one, here are my limitations. Like these are the things I can do well, and these are the things I can't necessarily do well. And two, the reason I'm responding is to help sort of propel this conversation. And I think that that framing is really important. We don't want AI replacing human judgment. Instead, we want AI to act as a prosthetic that sort of like gives us all a boost, makes us all sort of
Yes.
better, faster, smarter. Ethan Mollick calls this thinking with AI as opposed to AI thinking for
Yeah.
us.
Yes.
And so to your point about like ethical use, I think identifying what content is generated by AI is really important to us, and making sure that people understand the limitations of AI in these frames is really important to us. But at the same time, like not being so worried about that we don't try some of these things that have the potential to unlock entirely new types of experiences. So that's like the thinking that went into how we integrated it into the community.
I love it. I love it because, you know, in terms of all my experiences at the moment, I call it the AI sweet spot,
Mm.
where there is a beautiful thing to occur if we have the right elements of human interaction. And I love that, what you just said, that quote, rather than by Ethan, if you could just
Yeah,
repeat that.
yeah. Thinking with AI as opposed to AI thinking for us.
There we go. Right. And I've seen, you know, so many times where people are using this emerging technology for them, and it's just it's eroding trust in brands by allowing the AI to go forth on the internet and represent you and respond to people's comments in Facebook groups and on LinkedIn and things like that. When it's not you, it's acting for you. The trust and the harm to brands and personal brands is completely eroded and diminished. Whereas if you're working with, so it's a co-creation, it's a relationship where you're working with the AI, it actually can be brilliant when it's ethically declared, when it's labeled, when the limitations
Mm-hmm.
are shared. And I've seen this, so I see where it replies in the community, and then I see how that then sparks the ladder of conversation, which is fantastic, because that's enhancing an experience for someone. The prosthetic, I love the way that you've described that. It is. That is the way we've got to see it, right?
Yeah, I think like I think where we're going is pretty exciting because the limitations, there's like a lot to say. One of the reasons why that harm is happening that you were describing when people sort of like offload this is because there's a misperception that large language models in particular think.
Sentient.
Yeah, well, so we tend, like, human beings do this all the time. We anthropomorphize things because we don't fully understand like how they work. Like we do this to our pets too, right? We project onto them these like human qualities that they probably don't really have, and in part that's because we're like egotistical creatures by nature. Like, you know what I'm saying? We tend to, like, when you tell like a bunch of young people to draw an alien, they generally draw a human shaped creature that has some like very different you know what I'm saying, like different features.
Well, I have a theory about that, but that's a whole nother episode.
Whole nother episode. But I'm saying like there's something sort of like, it's not culturally specific. This is like it's baked into the hardware of humanity that we tend to like see things through the lens of like humans being this sort of like pinnacle of existence. And so that's why we anthropomorphize things like AI. And because the technology is quite effective at producing human like speech, we tend to believe that it is producing that human like speech the same way that we do, which is by thinking first, like reasoning about the thing, connecting to other ideas, and then forming a sentence that communicates from those root ideas, like tries to communicate our perception of the situation. But that is not what's happening. It's like really important for people to understand that we have a ways to go. Even the LLMs, like, all fundamentally are making shit up. And what I mean by that is that they are probabilistic models. Think of it as like, the predictive text input that you have on your phone where it like predicts the next word. Think of it as like that on steroids. Essentially what it's doing is it's like looking at all of human communication that's happened, and now like synthetic data and other things that are being produced. And it's coming up with a model where it says, what is the most likely next word or set of words that is related to the thing that the person has prompted me. So like if I say hello, the AI is not thinking, oh, how do I greet this person? Like, what's a nice way to say hello back? Instead, what it's doing is it's looking at all of this sort of human communication that it has in its data set, and it's saying the most common reply to hello is hello. So like the next word in a conversation that starts with hello is hello. Like that's literally what it's doing. And so that fundamental limitation means that it is only simulating speech. It is only simulating an understanding of an idea. It's not communicating from a place of understanding. Instead, it's communicating from a probabilistic prediction of what would be useful to spit back out based on what you have told it. And that, I think, is really hard for people to understand because it's like so convincing sometimes. It like gets it so
Yeah,
right
it
sometimes.
is. It is. But
Go
also,
ahead.
I think there's different levels and layers. And, as I'm learning more about how I can really make AI really, really work for me, it's in the training, it's in the input, it's in the learning of, and what I can tell is there's been a hell of a lot of training and learning in your
Yes.
AI tool, because the
Yes.
way that it responds is very learned of the approach and of the language and of the sort of the delivery.
Yes.
It's not a generic AI response.
Yes. So that the way to think about it is I can increase the probability that it does the right thing by training it, but I cannot reduce to zero the probability that it does something really stupid or harmful.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that, to your point about ethical use, I think like people should be thinking about that when they consider like how exactly they're applying AI. If you're okay with the risk that it could do something very stupid or harmful, because there are some situations where it's actually okay, especially if you set the context around that communication correctly, that say like, this is AI, it might make mistake. Like I think there like you can take a bigger risk. But if you're pretending it's you, how willing are you to have a thing go out, like, is a 1% risk, so every 100 responses it does something stupid or harmful? Is that okay? Is that acceptable to you? But I think most people aren't thinking about it that way, right? Because they're like testing it and they're like, this works, like all the tests that I've done, it works. But there's like the probability still exists, and in fact it is almost certainly going to happen at some point that it does the wrong thing. And the question is like, have you set the context well enough to make it doing the wrong thing not harmful to you or your brand or to other people?
Such a good question. I would love everybody listening who is thinking about using it, who is using it in their business, to ask yourself that question, because it's so important, and it can be the flip of a switch between someone not wanting to work with you or, be your client, and someone who is, fully invested and on board in everything that you are and you stand for. This is such a fascinating topic. I have so many questions, like, the technicalities of it, but I will save those because I think that this episode, I really wanted to share something that it's really been something that I've been championing for quite a while now. And
we thank
has
you for that.
inspired me because my whole career has been in communication, leadership development, communication. However, and I have my own approach, which is has been inspired a little bit by this, but it's around influence.
Mm-hmm.
So I really have loved talking to you about this, and I encourage anyone listening to check out the show notes, because we're going to put links in there about information about the resources. There's an amazing podcast and the community, of course, as well. But as always, when I speak to my guests and have candid conversations, I like to finish by asking, Jason, what words have changed your life?
Yeah, I'm going to share I'll reveal something personal, which is like I've had a fair amount of therapy in my life. And there was a moment in that trajectory that like was very clearly a fulcrum for me, which is the suggestion to focus on the things you can control. And this was so fundamental for me because I spent so much time worrying about things that were just fundamentally out of my control that it was literally debilitating. And going back to my point about like giving myself permission to energetically follow people who are already excited about radical candor, as opposed to trying to change the minds of these other people. I think in my hubris, and before I like understood this sort of concept of locus of control and this like phrase, like focus on the things that you can control, I think I would have tried to change people's minds, and it would have been exactly the wrong thing to do. So not only has it changed my life personally because it helps me navigate the world in a better way, generally speaking, but I think it also fundamentally affected the trajectory of radical candor as a business. So I'm sure that's a common thing and people have heard this phrase before, but for me, I think I was like the first time I really internalized it was like 35 years old. It was a really helpful redirect to put me on the course I'm on now.
Oh, that's so profound, because the first leadership model I learned when I got into leadership development was the circle of influence, circle of concern, which is basically exactly the same thing. It's a circle of control. And when I had to sort of train it out. And I remember when I first did it, it wasn't sitting, it wasn't landing. But when it did, oh my God, when I just focused on, and I could identify the things that were in my circle of concern, but I couldn't do anything about. And I just spent time focusing on the things that I can control and the things I can influence as well. The game really changed. So that one I can really resonate with that. And I'm sure lots of people will as well. Jason, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute honor to talk to you. And as I say, for anybody interested in this amazing movement, please check out the show notes. Thank you.
I really appreciate it.